Imagine a future, right, where you don't need to spend years, struggling with grammar rules, memorizing endless vocab lists.
Or those really awkward conversations.
Exactly. Sweating through those just to talk
Mm.
to anyone, anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
Sounds like pure science fiction, doesn't it?
Right.
This idea of a global village where language barriers just vanish,
Yeah.
instantly mediated by tech.
Mm-hmm. It really does.
But what if that future is actually, well, much closer than we think? What happens when machines become the universal interpreters?
That is the kind of provocative question that really jumps out at you from the stack of source material we've been digging into for this deep dive.
Right.
We've been sifting through, research papers, recent tech articles, essays, our own notes, and they're all sort of wrestling with this increasingly relevant question. Will these rapid advancements in technology, specifically AI, real-time translation, will they fundamentally change the whole landscape of global communication?
Yeah. And maybe even make languages like English, the one that's long been seen as the essential global skill,
Yeah,
maybe make it less necessary.
precisely. That's the core tension.
Okay, so our mission in this deep dive is basically to take all those arguments, the
Right.
research, the different viewpoints from this stack of sources, and really unpack them thoroughly for you.
Yeah.
We're going to explore the specific tech possibilities they describe, look at the potential shifts in global dynamics that might come out of this,
Hmm.
delve into those often overlooked cultural dimensions of language that some pieces really highlight.
Which are crucial.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And touch on the complex ethical considerations that several sources bring up. Our goal is just to distill the key insights, strictly based only on what this material tells us.
Right. No personal opinions here, just reporting on the sources.
Exactly. What might be gained in this possible future? What could be lost? And, importantly, what vital questions does this whole scenario pose for you as you navigate a world where the rules of communication seem to be, well, shifting right under our feet?
Because, let's face it, as several of the historical articles in our sources point out, for decades the reality has been pretty clear.
Yeah.
English fluency has been presented, and often genuinely was, an essential skill if you wanted to operate on a global stage.
No question.
It was the default for international business deals, for groundbreaking science, high-stakes diplomacy, and, most of the early internet.
Right. It felt less like a nice to have and more like the mandatory gateway, didn't it?
Yeah.
To opportunity, higher education, real global connection.
Totally. The gateway.
But the consensus across a lot of our source material now is that this dynamic, it isn't fixed, it's changing, and changing fast.
Driven primarily by this rise of real-time multilingual technology.
Okay, so let's unpack that transformation first. What do the sources say is actually enabling this?
Right. So the technical papers and articles in our stack, they point directly to recent, pretty significant breakthroughs in artificial intelligence, especially in areas like natural language processing, machine learning. And these are coupled with advances in augmented reality. Those are the foundational technologies making this possible.
And it's not just theory.
No, not anymore. The sources suggest the practical application pieces are really starting to click into place, things that weren't feasible even just a few years back.
And they get specific about the devices, right? Not just apps on phones.
Exactly. We're moving beyond pulling out your phone and typing. The sources describe integrated wearable tech, things like smart glasses or earbuds that become a discrete part of your everyday life.
So almost invisible.
That seems to be the goal. One technical brief we looked at described the core idea. These tools could automatically capture spoken language from someone else,
Right.
translate it instantly into your native tongue, and deliver it right to your ear.
So you're sitting across from someone speaking, say, Japanese,
Yeah.
but through your earbuds, you're hearing it arrive seamlessly in perfect English or Spanish or whatever you choose.
Exactly. The delay becomes negligible. It feels almost like they are speaking your language.
Wow. Okay, and then there's the augmented reality part. That sounds even wilder.
It does. Another article highlighted this. It talked about using AR to display subtitles, kind of floating in your field of vision, maybe overlaid on the speaker.
Which is useful in itself.
Sure. But then it described this truly next-level potential. Using AR to actually simulate the speaker's lips moving in sync with the translated language you're hearing.
Whoa. Okay, that's almost uncanny.
It is. That level of detail, trying to perfectly marry the sound and the visuals of communication, it's a really vivid detail from the sources, aiming for a naturalness that's way beyond just text or audio.
So not just translating words, but the whole communication package.
Well, that's the ambition. And what's particularly emphasized in the research papers we reviewed is this goal to preserve the nuance.
Nuance, how so?
They aren't just aiming for literal word-for-word translation that sounds, robotic.
Right, like the early translation tools.
Exactly. The goal, according to these sources, is for the tech to capture and convey tone, emotion, maybe even cultural context clues where possible,
And personality.
and even aspects of personality and speech. It's not just about what the words mean, but the way they're said, the feeling behind them.
If they can pull that off on a wide scale,
Yeah.
that's a monumental leap.
Huge. It goes way beyond current tools, which often just flatten out those really crucial human elements.
And this isn't just lab experiments. The sources mention actual companies working on this.
Oh, yeah. They're not talking about some distant, abstract future. Several pieces explicitly name major industry players pouring resources into these systems right now.
Like who?
Names like Meta, Google, Apple. They come up repeatedly. So this grounds the whole futuristic idea in current, very well-funded industry efforts.
Right. These aren't fringe concepts. They're strategic initiatives by massive companies.
Exactly. Which leads us straight to the immediate central question that several articles in our stack posed, the one framing this whole deep dive. If machines can provide instant, seamless, maybe even tonally accurate translation of everything, effectively erasing the language barrier in real time, why would you still need to study English? Or French, or Mandarin, or any other second language, at least for, practical communication?
The fundamental necessity might just disappear.
The tech itself potentially removes it.
Okay. So that takes us into the section where several sources really grapple with the fallout. What happens to the existing linguistic order? They talk about the potential end of English hegemony.
Right. As we touched on, English's role, it's been huge globally for decades.
Undeniably.
One historical essay we read detailed its rise fueled by economic power, science publishing norms, the internet spread.
It became the lingua franca, the assumed common ground, the required skill if you wanted to play on the global stage.
It really was seen and often functioned as that gateway to opportunity.
But the argument now, across much of our source material, is that if this seamless AI translation becomes widespread, becomes reliable,
then English's long-standing dominance could genuinely decline. Significantly.
the need for everyone to converge on one human language, like English, for international chat, it might just evaporate. That's what article after article suggested.
Yeah.
And the sources give some really specific, compelling examples to illustrate this, to paint a picture of what that future could look like.
What kind of examples?
Well, one scenario described was a young entrepreneur in Morocco. She's negotiating a complex business contract directly with a client in China.
Okay. Today, that conversation is almost certainly happening in English.
Exactly. Both sides need fluency, or you need human interpreters, which adds cost and complexity.
Right.
But in this potential future, with these real-time translation tools, earbuds, glasses, whatever, the Moroccan speaks comfortably in Arabic. The Chinese client speaks Mandarin. The tech mediates instantly, flawlessly, for both.
So they just focus on the business deal?
Precisely. Neither person needs to know the other's language or the current go-between language of English. It bypasses the intermediary.
Wow. Okay, that's a powerful image. Any others?
Yeah, another strong example from the sources. Think of a farmer in a rural part of Brazil. He wants the latest cutting-edge agricultural know-how.
Okay. Right now, a lot of that specialized info, sustainable farming, pest control, might be in English language forums, papers, podcasts.
Right, often primarily in English.
Right.
But these sources suggest this farmer could just listen to a super detailed technical podcast from an expert in, say, India.
Delivered in Hindi.
Delivered entirely in Hindi, but he hears it instantly translated into perfect, understandable Portuguese.
So he gets vital, specialized knowledge directly, without needing English or even Hindi.
Exactly. Which underscores a point several sources really emphasize: the potential here for democratizing access.
Access to information, access to global participation.
Right. For people who don't speak English as a first language, and that's most of the world, the current system can be a huge barrier. An extra hurdle to jump just to participate fully in the global economy,
Right.
or access education, or contribute to knowledge exchange.
And this technology, according to the sources, could seriously level that playing field.
potentially benefiting billions of non-English speakers by giving them direct, unmediated access to global conversations and info in their own language.
This connects to an idea from one particularly insightful essay. We read the concept of the universal interpreter.
Okay, what's up?
It argued that instead of the world needing a single universal human language that tons of people have to learn for international stuff, which has basically been English, the machines themselves could step into that role. The technology becomes the common link, the intermediary layer, not a shared skill among humans.
So the need to learn a specific language to communicate globally just fades away, replaced by the need to access the tech.
That's the potential future outlined.
Which, I mean, on the surface, that sounds incredibly liberating, doesn't it? Breaking down these age-old barriers that have limited so many people.
It does sound freeing.
But this is exactly where the sources collectively hit the pause button and raise a really crucial follow-up question. If we no longer need English or any second language for just basic practical communication, what do we potentially lose?
Right. And maybe more importantly, what else do we gain from language learning itself, beyond just the practical stuff, something technology might not be able to replicate?
And this leads us into a deeper look at what language actually is, what it means to us as humans. A point the more philosophical essays in our stack really hammered home.
Absolutely. Because while the AI tech described in the technical sources sounds incredibly advanced, aiming for that faithful translation of tone and emotion, the more culturally focused articles are quick to point out what they see as a fundamental limitation. While AI might get incredibly good at translating what is said the literal meaning, maybe even the emotional tone, these sources argue it still fundamentally struggles with understanding and conveying how and why people say things in a particular way, the stuff rooted in specific cultural, historical, personal contexts.
The subtext, cultural baggage.
Exactly. And that how and why, these articles argue, that's where the true, maybe untranslatable depth of language lies.
They emphasize language isn't just a tool for sending info packets between brains.
Far from it. It's presented as this powerful carrier of a culture's history, its values, its whole way of thinking. It's tied intrinsically to identity, both individual and collective.
So the way a phrase is built in one language, the subtle shades of meaning a word picks up over centuries.
The rhythm, the cadence of speech in a community, these things are deeply embedded in the culture that shaped them, and automated translation might just flatten all that out or miss it entirely.
That makes sense.
And several pieces make a really strong case that you gain so much by the very process of learning a language, something that just using a translation tool, no matter how perfect, simply cannot replicate.
It's not just about getting a new skill, like learning to use software.
No, they frame it as more fundamental, a cognitive and emotional transformation. It's like you're rewiring your brain in a way to see and interact with the world differently.
So what do the sources say you learn through that process? What specifically does language acquisition give you that translation tools don't?
Well, for starters, you begin to grasp the humor of another culture.
Which is notoriously hard to translate.
Exactly, because it's often based on intricate wordplay, specific cultural references, deep social context that an AI might just miss.
Okay, what else?
You gain real access to the poetry, the philosophy, the literature, the music, the art forms that grew out of that language. Experiencing them in their original form often has a power, a beauty, layers of meaning that get seriously diminished or even lost when filtered through translation.
You lose the original flavor.
You do. And crucially, multiple sources highlight that learning a language builds empathy in a really unique way.
How so?
It forces you actively to step outside your own linguistic framework, which is also your cultural and cognitive framework, and genuinely try to see the world from a different viewpoint. You start to understand the subtle nuances in thought and expression that shape how people from different backgrounds perceive reality, how they solve problems, how they relate to each other.
So it gives you mental flexibility.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. This ability to switch between cultural and linguistic frameworks is presented as this profound cognitive and interpersonal benefit. And the sources attribute it directly to the effortful, immersive process of learning the language, something just getting translated output can't replicate.
Okay, so this leads us to a really key distinction that one particularly insightful essay made. It feels like a central takeaway from our whole stack of sources, actually.
What's the distinction?
It differentiates between the need for a second language and the want for one.
Need versus want. Okay.
Technology, this perspective argues, might genuinely remove the practical need, for basic communication, getting directions, making a purchase, accessing facts, even negotiating that contract, like in the earlier example.
It removes the necessity driven by global pressure or just surviving in an interconnected world.
Right. But, the argument continues, it doesn't necessarily remove the want.
Ah.
You might still powerfully want to learn a language, even if a machine translates perfectly, because the reasons go beyond just practicality. They tap into deeper human desires, identity.
Okay, so what does that want involve, according to the sources? What are those deeper motivations?
Well, they highlight things AI translation doesn't really address. It's about a deeper kind of human connection, beyond just swapping information.
Right.
It's about truly connecting with people from another culture on their terms. Understanding not just their words, but the cultural context, the history, the emotional subtext baked into those words, often through shared idioms or references lost in translation. It's about appreciating art literature, films, music, even faith traditions in their original linguistic and cultural setting, experiencing them as intended.
Getting the full richness.
Exactly. And it's about understanding the unwritten social codes, the historical echoes in everyday phrases, the specific cultural identity expressed through language choices. Things that AI, no matter how smart, might just never fully grasp.
So the argument in several sources is that the human richness, the cognitive boost, the empathy, the deep cultural understanding you get from the effort of learning, that's something distinct, valuable, and separate from just making yourself understood transactionally.
Yeah. It's about connection, understanding, identity in a way that a tool, however seamless, might struggle to deliver.
Okay. Which then shifts the conversation, as several sources point out, towards some pretty significant geopolitical and ethical concerns.
Right. If individuals, communities, whole societies become heavily reliant on these AI tools for global communication, for accessing information.
Then one perspective in our notes argued you create a new kind of dependency,
Not on mastering English, perhaps.
but a dependency on the platform, on the technology providing the service.
And this immediately brings up that critical question several cautionary articles pose. Who controls these platforms?
Yeah. Who builds them? Who maintains the AI models? Who updates them? Who sets the rules for using them? What are their biases, intentional or not, baked into the algorithms?
Our sources detail some specific worries stemming from this potential concentration of control.
Like what?
Some articles explicitly ask, could Western tech companies, who are kind of leading the AIRR charge right now, could they inadvertently or even deliberately end up dominating global communication through their control of these essential translation platforms?
So it's not just about convenience, it's about power, influence, potential gatekeeping over information flow and interaction.
Exactly. It's a big question.
And there's also a major question about access, isn't there? One research paper framed it as potentially worsening the digital divide.
How so?
Well, if these sophisticated, seamless translation tools are mainly delivered through expensive, cutting-edge wearables,
Right.
or if they need constant access to high-speed internet and cloud processing, will poorer communities, rural areas, especially in developing nations, have equal access?
Or does it create a new barrier, a new form of exclusion, where if you can't afford the tech, you're left out of the global conversation, even in your own language?
That's the concern raised. A new divide based on technology access, not language skill.
And privacy. That came up multiple times in the sources.
Understandably, if your most private, sensitive conversations, personal, business, political, are being captured, processed, translated by a third-party AI.
Can you really trust that system with your data?
Yeah.
What about surveillance, data security, misuse of information, when your intimate exchanges are mediated by powerful centralized tech controlled by a corporation or potentially accessed by governments?
Yeah, the trust issue is huge. Some of the more critical essays we looked at frame these potential challenges using the term digital colonialism.
Okay, explain that.
They suggest that relying on technology controlled mainly by dominant global powers could lead to new forms of dependence and exploitation, kind of mirroring historical colonial patterns. The argument is that this future centralizes power not just linguistically, but in the actual tech infrastructure enabling communication. It puts immense influence into the hands of a few big tech giants.
And it's important we reiterate, the sources are presenting these as potential challenges, serious questions raised by this scenario. They're not necessarily taking a definitive political stance.
Exactly. The focus is on highlighting the potential dependency, the access issues, the control questions inherent in relying on powerful centralized platforms for something as fundamental as communication.
Okay. So Given this potentially massive shift in how we communicate globally, our sources also look at how education might need to change.
Right. If that immediate practical need for rote language memorization, grammar drills, getting basic fluency just to get by globally, if
Yeah.
that's significantly reduced or even gone,
How does the focus of language education, or maybe even general education, adapt? The sources suggest schools might need to shift priorities quite significantly, away from the traditional models.
yeah. Instead of spending years primarily on conjugating verbs or memorizing vocab lists.
Which takes up a lot of time now.
A huge amount. One educational paper suggested schools could dramatically increase focus on teaching intercultural understanding.
So less about the words, more about the people behind them.
Exactly. Going beyond language itself to focus directly on the customs, values, nonverbal cues, history, perspectives of different cultures, preparing students to interact respectfully and effectively in a diverse world, even if language isn't the technical hurdle anymore.
Shifting from how to say the words to how to understand the person.
Well put. And critically, several sources point out the absolute need to develop AI literacy.
You mean,
If these translation tools are everywhere, built into our daily devices, students need more than just knowing they exist. They need to learn how to work with them responsibly and effectively.
so not just blindly trusting the output.
Definitely not. It's about understanding the tool's capabilities, but also its limits, its potential biases. Knowing when to trust it, when to be cautious, when to maybe seek clarification. Using it as a sophisticated aid to enhance understanding, not as a replacement for critical thinking, cultural awareness, and actual communication skills.
Wielding the tool wisely.
Exactly. And other potential new priorities mentioned in the sources. Focusing on skills technology doesn't replace. Skills that become even more valuable when basic communication is automated.
Like what?
Things like creativity, critical thinking, emotional intelligence, global citizenship, the capacities that really define human ingenuity, collaboration, empathy.
The uniquely human skills.
Those are the ones that remain essential, perhaps become paramount, in a world where machines handle the basic translation.
So in this potential future described across our sources, learning a language changes fundamentally. It moves from being seen as a necessity
Driven by global pressure, economic demands, the sheer need to communicate.
to becoming a genuine choice.
Right. A choice that, according to the more culturally oriented sources, would likely be driven by very different, more intrinsic motivations than often exist today.
Not just, I need English for my career.
Less of that pressure, potentially. The motivations might be fueled more by passion, a genuine love for a specific culture, its history, its art, its philosophy, its people,
Or identity.
or deeply tied to identity, maybe connecting with your heritage, understanding ancestral texts, fully participating in a specific cultural community.
Could it still be career-related?
Oh, sure. But perhaps focused on roles where that deep cultural understanding, that nuanced interpersonal communication, the empathy you gain from linguistic immersion, where those are the key assets, rather than just needing basic transactional fluency to get a job done.
So the external pressure lifts.
Potentially. Allowing for more personal, meaningful, intrinsic motivations to drive the considerable effort of language learning.
Okay, so let's try and bring this deep dive together. We've really explored this core tension running through our stack of source material.
Yeah, it's quite a dynamic.
On one side, you've got the technological trajectory, AI, AR, real-time translation, building what some sources call these incredibly powerful tech bridges.
Bridges that could potentially remove the practical, immediate need to learn a second language just to talk to people globally.
Which could seriously disrupt English's long-standing dominance as the mandatory global skill for access and opportunity.
But then, on the other hand, the sources present this really powerful counter-argument
Which is,
that AI, as it stands, or even as projected, just cannot replace the profound human richness, the deep cultural understanding, the empathy, the cognitive benefits, the connection that you gain by the very act of learning a language. Through effort, through immersion.
these sources really highlight what could be lost if we lean solely on translation tools and maybe forego that challenging but rewarding process of language acquisition itself.
Yeah, it's a significant potential loss they point to.
And this nuanced paradox, this tension, it's maybe best captured by a line that echoed in slightly different ways across a couple of the essays we looked at. It circles back to that idea. Technology is rapidly creating a world where you might not need a second language.
To be understood by others.
Right, because the tools can make your words perfectly intelligible to anyone, anywhere. Your message gets across.
And this is the kicker. The sources leave us with this powerful final thought, something that really resonates and asks you, the listener, to consider what you value most in human interaction and understanding.
Go on.
You might still need a second language.
To be understood.
No, to truly understand others.
That's the distinction. Being understood versus truly understanding.
Exactly. That balance between technological convenience and deep human connection, between making your point and grasping theirs in all its cultural depth.
That seems to be the fundamental question this stack of sources ultimately leaves with you. What kind of future do you envision for language and communication? What will you prioritize?
It's definitely something significant to ponder as these technologies continue to race ahead.